They say you don't truly know someone until you see them at their worst. That's not true. You don't truly know someone until you realize the person sleeping beside you every night might not exist at all. For 5 years, I shared a bed with a man who knew my breathing patterns, my coffee order, the exact spot between my shoulders where stress lived. A man who kissed my forehead like punctuation at the end of a sentence, who spoke about values the way other people spoke about faith. And all that time, I never questioned the most dangerous possibility, that I wasn't married to a man, I was married to a brand. If that opening makes your stomach tighten just a little, stay with me. And if you've ever felt something was off, but couldn't explain why, go ahead and tap like, leave a comment, or follow the channel. Not because this is entertainment, but because stories like this have a way of finding the people who need them most. My name is Dr. Amina Hart. I'm a forensic accountant. I make a living following numbers where they don't want to be followed. I help organizations uncover fraud, trace money through shell companies, expose people who believe complexity will protect them. Ironically, I never thought to audit my own marriage. On paper, Graham Whitaker was flawless. A white American man with the kind of polished confidence donors loved and journalists trusted. A real estate developer who talked about revitalizing communities and ethical growth. The kind of man who shook hands firmly, looked people straight in the eye, and said things like, "Transparency matters," without flinching. We met in Washington, D.C., at a charity panel on urban housing equity. He was charming without being loud, attentive without being needy. When he learned what I did for a living, he smiled and said, "So you're the person people fear when the truth is expensive." I laughed. I didn't realize he was rehearsing. From the outside, our life looked curated but believable. A townhouse in Capitol Hill, dinner parties with nonprofit directors and policy advisors, weekend runs along the river. He told everyone he was lucky to have a wife who was brilliant and independent. And I told myself that his frequent late nights were the cost of ambition. After all, we were both busy. We were both building something. That's what grown marriages look like, right? But absence has a texture. And after a while, you can feel it even when you stop naming it. Graham was never gone in obvious ways. He didn't disappear for weeks. He didn't forget anniversaries. He didn't come home smelling like someone else's perfume. His disappearances were clean, professional, reasonable. A site visit in Baltimore, a donor dinner that ran late, a planning meeting that turned into drinks. Excuses that slid neatly into the grooves of his public image. What I didn't understand then was that Graham didn't just live his life, he managed perception. Every smile, every story, every absence was calibrated, not to deceive with chaos, but with consistency. He wasn't hiding from me. He was performing for me. The first real crack came on a Tuesday morning that should have been forgettable. I was reviewing a foundation's expense reports at the kitchen island, half listening to the hum of the city outside, when I noticed a delivery receipt tucked beneath a stack of mail. Same courier we used, same account. But the name on it wasn't mine. It wasn't his either. I stared at it longer than necessary, my mind doing that quiet recalculation it does when something doesn't fit. Graham walked in moments later, kissed my cheek, asked if I wanted eggs. I almost mentioned it, almost laughed it off, almost handed him the receipt and said, "Hey, what's this?" But years of my work had taught me one thing. When something doesn't make sense, don't rush to explain it away. Document it, observe it, wait. So I slid the receipt back where I found it and said nothing. That night, Graham didn't come home. He texted just before midnight, "Crash at the office. Big day tomorrow. Love you." I replied with a heart emoji and turned off my phone. Lying alone in our bed, I realized something unsettling. I wasn't angry. I wasn't scared. I was curious, because on some level, deeper than trust and deeper than love, I had begun to sense the truth. Not the details, just the shape of it. The feeling that my marriage was airtight on the surface and hollow underneath. That the man I slept beside every night might be less a partner and more a projection. And I didn't yet know how far that projection went. I didn't yet know there was another apartment, another woman, another life. But I knew this. Brands survive on silence. And silence was about to cost him everything. The envelope waited for me like an accusation. It was cream-colored, heavier than standard mail, sealed with deliberate care. My name, Amina Hart, was written in neat, slanted handwriting that didn't belong to anyone I knew well enough to write to me by hand. No return address, no logo, no explanation. For a long moment, I didn't open it. Years of professional instinct whispered that this was a threshold moment, one of those quiet pivots where life divides cleanly into before and after, even if you don't realize it yet. I stood in the hallway of our townhouse, heels still on, my coat half slipped from one shoulder, listening to the distant sound of traffic and the faint hum of the refrigerator. The house felt too still, like it was holding its breath. I broke the seal. The letter inside was short. 3 pages, no wasted words. Amina, I don't know if you will ever forgive me, but I can no longer live with my silence. I recognized the handwriting immediately then. Margaret Whitaker, Graham's mother. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with a sudden, inexplicable dread. Margaret was not a dramatic woman. She was controlled, precise, allergic to mess. She spoke in measured tones and avoided conflict the way some people avoided sugar. If she was writing this, it meant she had exhausted every other option. The letter shook in my hands as I read. She wrote about shame, about loyalty twisted into cowardice, about knowing something for years and convincing herself that staying quiet was a form of love. She wrote about watching her son become someone she no longer recognized, and about the price she'd paid to keep the family's image intact. Then came the sentence that fractured the room. Graham has been living with another woman in Baltimore. Her name is Sophia. She is 8 months pregnant with his child. The words didn't register all at once. They arrived in pieces like debris after an explosion. Another woman, Baltimore, pregnant. I reread the sentence 3 times, my mind refusing to assemble it into meaning. My body reacted before my thoughts did. My vision narrowed. My mouth went dry. I had the distinct, absurd urge to sit down on the floor, as if gravity had suddenly doubled. Margaret went on. It hadn't been a fling. It hadn't been recent. It had been years. A second apartment, a carefully maintained routine, a life built parallel to mine, hidden behind business trips and donor meetings and carefully worded excuses. Margaret had discovered it by accident, seeing them together at a neighborhood market when she'd visited unannounced. Graham had begged her to stay silent, promised it was temporary, promised he would handle it. He never did. I stayed quiet because I was afraid of what telling the truth would cost, she wrote. I was afraid of losing my son, afraid of losing the family we built, afraid of what people would say. I told myself it wasn't my place. But every day I didn't tell you, I betrayed you too. By the time I reached the end, my hands were steady again. That surprised me. I expected hysteria, tears, rage, some cinematic collapse. Instead, a strange calm settled over me, cold, clear, and sharp enough to cut. This wasn't disbelief, this was recognition. 1,000 small inconsistencies suddenly aligned, snapping into place with brutal precision. The late nights, the missing warmth, the way Graham always seemed to be performing devotion rather than living it. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall long after I finished reading. There was a final paragraph, written smaller, tighter. I am telling you now because Graham plans to leave you. He wants to control how the story is told. He wants people to believe your marriage ended long ago, that you pushed him away, that this new life simply happened. I could not let him make you the villain of a lie you did not create. My phone buzzed on the table. Graham's name lit up the screen. Running late, don't wait up. I looked at the message and felt something unexpected pass through me. Not anger, not grief, but clarity. The kind that arrives when the last illusion falls away and nothing is left to protect. Somewhere in Baltimore, there was a woman carrying my husband's child, believing she was building a future with an honest man. Somewhere in Washington, D.C., there was a man who thought silence was still on his side. And sitting alone at that kitchen table, I understood the truth that would change everything. This was no longer about heartbreak. It was about narrative. And I would not let him write mine. Grief announced itself immediately. It came in waves that had no rhythm, no mercy. It woke me in the early hours with a tightness in my chest that felt like drowning. It showed up in the shower, in the grocery store, in the middle of sentences I could no longer finish. It was loud and unruly and demanding, and for a few days I let it have its way with me. I cried into towels so I wouldn't wake the neighbors. I stared at walls until my eyes burned. I replayed conversations with Graham, dissecting every word for signs I'd missed, every moment where love had quietly turned into theater. But grief, for all its volume, was useless. It didn't explain anything. It didn't protect me. It didn't stop what was coming. And something in me, something honed by years of doing this work, understood that if I stayed inside the noise too long, I would lose the only advantage I had left. So I gave grief a boundary. During the day, I functioned. I answered emails. I joined conference calls. I listened to clients explain financial irregularities with shaking voices, and I offered them calm, measured solutions. I wore clean lines in neutral colors and moved through the world like a woman who had everything under control. At night, after Graham texted his predictable updates, late meeting, early start, miss you, I allowed myself exactly 1 hour. 1 hour to fall apart. 1 hour to feel the weight of betrayal press into my ribs until breathing hurt. 1 hour to mourn the marriage I thought I had, the future I thought we were building. Then the timer went off, and I became someone else. Strategy is a discipline. It does not raise its voice. It does not seek comfort. It asks only one question, over and over again, until the answer becomes unavoidable. What is true? The first truth was this. Graham was planning to leave, and he intended to do it cleanly. Clean for him. He would not confess. He would not apologize publicly. He would rewrite the past until I became a footnote, cold, distant, career-obsessed. A necessary sacrifice in the story of his reinvention. The second truth was harder. If I reacted emotionally, I would hand him exactly what he needed. Men like Graham thrived on chaos they didn't have to own, on women who screamed while they smiled, on scenes that could be dismissed as hysteria. He had spent years polishing his image. One uncontrolled moment from me would become his shield, so I didn't confront him. I didn't ask questions he could lie his way out of. I didn't search his phone or follow him across state lines. I didn't let him see the shift that had already occurred beneath my skin. Instead, I did what I had always done when faced with deception. I observed. I opened a new notebook, paper, not digital, and wrote one line at the top of the first page. Assume nothing. Prove everything. It was a rule I taught junior analysts when they got too confident. Now it applied to my own life. I documented patterns, departure times, return times, language changes. The way Graham spoke about Baltimore with casual familiarity, the way he avoided details that would anchor him to specifics. I noted expenses without touching accounts yet, just watched how often he referenced project costs that didn't align with anything public. I paid attention to myself too, to the instinct I had learned to suppress in relationships because it was inconvenient, because it made other people uncomfortable. That instinct was awake now, razor sharp, and it was whispering the same thing my spreadsheets always did when fraud was present. This isn't an accident. This is design. On the 5th night after Margaret's letter, I made my first call, not to a friend, not to a therapist, to Elena Brooks, an attorney whose name was never advertised and whose reputation was built entirely on results. We had met years earlier during a nonprofit embezzlement case that ended quietly and decisively. I didn't tell her my story. Not yet. I asked hypotheticals. What happens, I said evenly, if one spouse uses joint assets to support another household without consent? There was a pause on the line. Not hesitation, but recalibration. That depends, Elena replied. How long has it been happening? Years. And how clean do you want this to be? I looked around the kitchen Graham and I had renovated together. The open shelving, the carefully chosen finishes, the life that now felt like a stage set. As clean as the truth, I said. No cleaner. Another pause. Then don't confront him, Elena said. Not yet. People lie better when they think they're safe. Let him keep talking. When the call ended, I sat alone in the dark, the city humming outside the windows. I thought about the woman in Baltimore, carrying a child, believing in a man who had built his life on omission. I thought about the mother who had stayed silent too long. I thought about the version of myself that would have begged for honesty, for closure, for mercy. That woman was gone. Grief still lived in my body, heavy and unresolved. But strategy had taken the wheel. And strategy understood something grief could not. This wasn't a moment. It was a campaign. And I had no intention of losing. Every collapse begins with something small. Not the kind of lie that explodes. Not a confession screamed in a doorway or lipstick on a collar. The truly dangerous deceptions unravel quietly when one insignificant detail refuses to behave the way it should. In my work, we called it the first thread. The anomaly so minor it was easy to dismiss, yet so stubborn it demanded attention. For me, it was a line item. I didn't open our joint accounts right away. That would have been too loud, too fast. The equivalent of kicking down a door when I didn't yet know what was on the other side. Instead, I started with what Graham volunteered freely, his stories. That week, he mentioned Baltimore 3 times, casually, like a place he barely noticed anymore. A zoning issue, a developer lunch, a quick site check that turned into a long day. The repetition was subtle, but repetition is never accidental. People return to familiar lies because familiarity feels safe. I opened my laptop late one night and pulled up public records, projects Graham had spoken about often enough that the details were supposed to be boring. Dates, permits, completion timelines. I wasn't searching for proof yet. I was searching for alignment. It didn't align. One commercial project he claimed required weekly oversight had wrapped 6 months earlier. Another had been delayed due to funding issues that would have made his presence unnecessary. The more I cross-referenced his explanations with verifiable data, the more negative space appeared. Time unaccounted for. Gaps disguised as effort. I felt a tightening in my chest. Not panic, but recognition. This was the feeling I got right before a case cracked open. The moment when the math stopped being neutral and started whispering intention. Still, I didn't touch the money. Instead, I watched behavior. Graham had always been careful, but now I noticed how efficient his carefulness was. The way he angled his phone away from me when messages came in. The way he never took calls on speaker anymore. The way his overnight bag stayed packed, as if his life required constant readiness. One evening, as he showered, I stood in our bedroom staring at that bag. It was unremarkable, black, soft-sided, easy to forget. But something about it bothered me. It wasn't what was inside. It was how often it was ready. I didn't open it. I sat on the edge of the bed and wrote in my notebook instead. Patterns suggest maintenance, not crisis. Second location likely permanent. Deception requires routine. The next morning, the universe handed me confirmation in the most mundane way possible. A notification pinged on my phone from our building's security app. Something I'd forgotten I even had access to. A routine alert. Lobby movement detected. Out of idle curiosity, I tapped it. The timestamp was wrong. It showed Graham entering the building at 6:12 p.m., then exiting again at 6:27, his overnight bag in hand. 15 minutes. Too short to be home, too long to be accidental. He hadn't mentioned stopping by. He'd told me he was already in Baltimore. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. This was it. Not the affair, not yet, the proof of choreography. The evidence that his movements were deliberate, measured, rehearsed. You don't live two lives by chance. You live them by design. That night, after Graham fell asleep beside me, I lay awake listening to his breathing. It was even, relaxed. The breathing of a man who believed he was winning. I reached a decision before dawn. I needed help. Not the kind that came with trench coats or dramatic stakeouts, but the kind that understood discretion, documentation, and patience. The kind that knew how to observe without disturbing the ecosystem. Her name was Kendra Shaw. Kendra had once helped me dismantle a fraudulent insurance ring that hid behind nonprofit shell accounts. She was meticulous, invisible when she needed to be, and immune to theatrics. When I called her, I didn't explain the emotional context. I explained the objective. I need confirmation of a second residence, I said. Patterns of occupancy, nothing illegal, nothing that can't stand up to scrutiny. She didn't ask why. Location? She asked. Baltimore. There was a pause, brief, thoughtful. Give me a week, she said, and don't change your behavior. That last part mattered more than anything, so I didn't change. I cooked dinner. I laughed at Graham's jokes. I asked about his meetings. I kissed him goodnight and told him to drive safely. I became the version of myself he expected, the wife who trusted, the woman who didn't pry, the partner who assumed good faith. Inside, I was pulling the thread. 3 days later, Kendra sent a single message. Found it. An apartment in a quiet Baltimore neighborhood. 1 bedroom, regular grocery deliveries, utilities in Graham's name, routed through a holding company I recognized immediately, one he'd once described to me as inactive. Inactive, it turned out, was a flexible word. Kendra's report was restrained, professional, devastating in its simplicity. Dates, frequencies, patterns, photographs that showed Graham entering the building with ease, like a man coming home. But it was the final detail that hollowed out my chest. She's pregnant, Kendra wrote, 8 months by my estimate, and she doesn't look like someone who knows she's sharing. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark. This was no longer a secret. It was an infrastructure. A second life funded, scheduled, and protected with the same precision Graham claimed to value in everything else. I thought about the delivery receipt, the late nights, the letter from his mother. All the threads I had ignored because pulling them would have meant accepting an unbearable truth. Now they were coming loose on their own, and I understood, with terrifying clarity, that this was only the beginning. Because once you find the first thread, you don't get to stop pulling. By the time Kendra Shaw came back with her first full report, I had stopped asking myself if Graham was lying. The only question left was how much. Kendra didn't dramatize her findings. She never did. She believed that facts, when arranged correctly, carried their own weight. Her emails were spare, her language neutral, her conclusions supported by timestamps, distances, and habits that no innocent explanation could survive. That restraint made the truth hit harder. The apartment in Baltimore wasn't temporary. It wasn't a crash pad or a convenience. It was lived in. Plants watered on schedule. Groceries restocked every Thursday. Trash taken out Sunday nights. A life with a rhythm that suggested comfort, not secrecy. Graham arrived there 3 to 4 nights a week. He didn't rush. He didn't look over his shoulder. In Kendra's photos, he moved with the ease of someone who belonged. In one image, he carried takeout bags and laughed at something the woman beside him had said. The sound wasn't captured, but I could imagine it. It was a laugh I hadn't heard in years. Unguarded, unburdened. That was the moment the betrayal cut deepest. Not the sex, not the lies, but the evidence that he had been present somewhere else, while I had been alone, explaining his absence to myself like a fool. Kendra's report continued. The woman's name was Sophia Reyes, 29, brand photographer, freelance contracts with lifestyle companies, small but steady, no criminal record, no history that suggested manipulation or malice. If anything, the details painted a portrait of someone earnest, hopeful, building a future she believed was legitimate. Graham had told her he was divorced. He'd shown her a different version of himself, less polished, more intimate. He talked about wanting a family, about slowing down, about finally being ready for commitment. He had not mentioned me at all. And then there was the money. This was where my professional instincts sharpened into something lethal. Graham hadn't simply paid for dinners or gifts. He had built infrastructure, credit cards in Sophia's name, backed by his accounts. Rent paid through a limited liability company I recognized instantly, one he had once described to me as a placeholder entity from an old deal. Transfers disguised as vendor reimbursements. Monthly patterns that matched prenatal expenses without ever naming them. Nothing overt, nothing sloppy, but together they formed a map of intent. He hadn't stumbled into this double life. He had engineered it. Kendra ended the report with a single line. He's careful, but he's comfortable. Comfort makes people careless. I thanked her and closed my laptop, forcing myself to sit with what I'd learned instead of rushing to the next step. Outside, the city moved as it always did. Sirens in the distance, laughter drifting up from the sidewalk. Life continuing without regard for the fact that mine had split cleanly down the middle. That night, Graham called instead of texting. "Long day," he said, his voice warm, familiar. Baltimore was a mess. I pictured him there, hours earlier, unlocking the door to an apartment where a pregnant woman waited for him with questions he never had to answer honestly. "Sounds exhausting," I replied. It wasn't an act. Exhaustion had settled into my bones, heavy and dull. But beneath it, something else had begun to take shape. Something steadier, sharper. Resolve. I didn't tell Graham what I knew. I didn't confront him with the photographs or the timelines or the financial trails that now lived in carefully labeled folders on my encrypted drive. I let him talk, let him embellish, let him believe the story was still his to control. When we hung up, my phone rang again. "Margaret," I hesitated before answering. There were questions I wanted to ask her, about how long she'd known, about how she'd justified her silence. But I already understood the answer. Silence, like deception, thrives on fear. "I was hoping you'd call," she said softly. "I have confirmation," I replied. No accusation, no comfort, just fact. She exhaled, a sound that carried years of suppressed guilt. "Then you know." "I know enough," I said, "and I know he's planning something." There was a pause on the line. "He wants to leave you without consequences," Margaret said finally. "He wants to walk into his new life clean." I closed my eyes. "Then he doesn't understand the situation," I said, "because I don't miss." It wasn't bravado, it was a statement of method. In my line of work, people like Graham always believed intelligence was enough to protect them, that complexity equaled safety, that if they stayed one step ahead, no one would ever catch up. They were wrong, because there is nothing more dangerous than a professional who has stopped working for a paycheck and started working for the truth. And I was no longer just uncovering a lie. I was preparing to end it. Understanding a lie is different from understanding why it was built. For days after Kendra's report, I couldn't stop asking myself the same question, not with anger, but with the focused curiosity I reserved for complex cases. Why maintain this for so long? Why risk exposure? Why not leave cleanly and decisively instead of splitting himself in half? The answer wasn't romantic. It wasn't tragic. It was strategic. Graham didn't need one woman. He needed two audiences. In Washington, D.C., he was the man with the right wife, the polished couple, the proof of concept marriage. We attended fundraisers where donors praised his values. Board members shook his hand and asked when he planned to run for office, as if it were inevitable. I stood beside him in tailored dresses, competent and composed, my presence signaling stability, discipline, respectability. I was not just his wife. I was part of the brand. In Baltimore, he didn't need that version of himself. There, he was softer, more human. He told Sophia stories about being misunderstood, about a marriage that had ended emotionally years ago. He played the wounded man who had finally found love again. The audience was smaller, more intimate, more forgiving. 2 stages, 2 scripts. One actor who believed he could keep them separate forever. The realization settled over me slowly, like something heavy lowering itself onto my chest. Graham wasn't confused. He wasn't torn between two loves. He wasn't avoiding a difficult conversation because he feared hurting people. He was avoiding it because honesty would cost him leverage. Divorce, done openly, would fracture the image he was cultivating. It would raise questions. It would invite scrutiny. It would force donors, colleagues, and future allies to look too closely at timelines, finances, and character. It would require him to explain why a man who preached integrity couldn't practice it at home. So he waited. He kept me in place while he assembled the next chapter of his life quietly. He let Sophia believe she was chosen while letting me believe I was secure. And when the moment came, when the pregnancy could no longer be hidden, he planned to step away from me gently, publicly, with just enough sadness to appear noble. I could already hear the story forming. We grew apart. She was always working. We tried. It wasn't anyone's fault. Faultless lies are the most dangerous kind. Margaret confirmed it 2 nights later when we spoke again. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with exhaustion. He's been asking how people would react, she admitted. Testing language, framing. He wants sympathy, not questions. Has he mentioned me? I asked. Yes, she said quietly. He says you're difficult to reach, emotionally unavailable. He says you chose your career over him. The words should have hurt more than they did. Instead, they landed with a dull finality. Of course he was laying the groundwork. Of course he was rehearsing his exit. People like Graham never leap without building a net. What he hadn't accounted for was this. I understood nets better than he ever would. I knew how they were woven. I knew where they tore under pressure. That night, I pulled every public-facing appearance we'd made together over the last 3 years. Photos, event programs, articles that mentioned his name alongside mine. I mapped the narrative he'd been selling, not just to me, but to the world. The pattern was unmistakable. Whenever he spoke about ethics, transparency, or doing the right thing, his personal life remained conspicuously absent. When asked about family, he smiled and deflected. When pressed, he gestured vaguely toward privacy and boundaries. He hadn't been protecting us. He'd been protecting himself. I thought about Sophia then, not as a rival, not as a threat, but as a woman who had been cast in a role without her consent. She wasn't his escape. She was his backup plan. The future he would step into once the optics were managed. And I understood something else, something colder and more precise than anger. Graham believed I would protect him, not because he trusted me, but because he underestimated me, because he assumed my dignity would keep me quiet, that my professionalism would prevent me from making a scene, that my pain would stay private, contained, manageable. He believed I would absorb the damage so he wouldn't have to. That belief was his greatest mistake. Because once you see the motive clearly, once you understand the architecture of the lie, you stop asking, why me? And start asking, how do I dismantle this? Graham needed 2 audiences to survive. I was about to make sure they met. There is a moment in every deception when the lie stops being defensive and becomes offensive. That was the moment I realized Graham was no longer hiding. He was preparing to strike. It happened quietly, the way all dangerous things do. A casual comment over dinner. A story repeated with slightly altered phrasing. A friend mentioning something Graham had confided in them. Something he had never said to me. He seems tired, one donor's wife said sympathetically at a reception. He told us you've both been under so much pressure. Careers pulling you in different directions. I smiled. I nodded. I thanked her for her concern. Inside, something cold locked into place. That was when I understood the trap. Graham wasn't waiting for the truth to come out. He was building a preemptive explanation, one that positioned him as patient, lonely, misunderstood. one that softened the ground beneath him so that when he finally stepped away, he wouldn't fall. And in his version of events, I wasn't a villain. I was something worse. I was an obstacle. The ambitious wife, the emotionally unavailable partner, the woman so focused on her work that she didn't notice her marriage slipping away. Not cruel, not abusive, just absent enough to justify everything that came next. It was brilliant in its cowardice. Because how do you defend yourself against an accusation that sounds reasonable? Against a story that invites empathy instead of outrage? Against a narrative that doesn't attack you outright, but quietly erases you? I didn't confront him when I saw it forming. I didn't correct the record or demand explanations. That would have tipped him off. Instead, I listened more carefully than ever before. Graham talked when he felt safe. He talked about timing, about how people changed, about how marriages sometimes ended not because of betrayal, but because of neglect. He practiced these lines casually, slipping them into conversations like test balloons, watching how people reacted. They reacted exactly as he hoped. Sympathy, understanding, gentle nods. That was the danger of his story. It didn't require lies, just selective truth. Yes, I worked a lot. Yes, our schedules were demanding. Yes, we had grown quieter with time. What his story didn't include was the second apartment, the pregnant woman, the money rerouted and renamed to keep it all alive. He was betting that nuance would protect him, that my restraint would become his alibi. Margaret confirmed it when we met in person for the first time since her letter. We sat in a quiet cafe far from the neighborhoods Graham frequented, our reflections faintly mirrored in the window between us. He's asking how to say it, she admitted, fingers wrapped tightly around her cup. How to make it sound humane. And you? I asked. I told him nothing, she said, shame threading through her voice. I told him he'd already done enough damage. I believed her. But belief wasn't enough anymore. Has he mentioned Baltimore? I asked. She shook her head. Never. Not once. Of course he hadn't. The omission was the point. That night, back in our townhouse, I watched Graham rehearse the role he thought he would soon perform. He talked about an upcoming family gathering, an annual Whitaker weekend at a lake property in upstate New York, a celebration tied to his father's donor network, board members, family friends, the kind of event where reputations were reaffirmed and futures quietly arranged. Mom really wants us there, he said lightly. I think it would be good. A reset. A reset. I looked at him across the kitchen island, at the man who had split his life so neatly that he believed it could never intersect. I realized then that the trap wasn't just for me, it was for the truth itself. If I stayed silent much longer, his story would harden into fact. It would be repeated, refined, remembered. And when the real truth finally surfaced, as it always does, it would sound messy by comparison, emotional, reactive, unreliable. That was the narrative trap. Whoever speaks first doesn't just speak, they define. I went to bed that night with a single, irreversible understanding settling into my bones. This was no longer about catching him. It was about timing. I couldn't expose him too early. That would let him scramble, reframe, deny. And I couldn't wait too long. That would let his version of events calcify beyond repair. I needed witnesses. I needed context. I needed a moment so undeniable that no amount of charm or revision could survive it. And suddenly, the lake weekend wasn't an inconvenience. It was an opportunity. Graham thought he was leading me gently toward an ending he controlled. He had no idea he was walking us both toward the only place a lie like his could die, in front of the very people he'd built it for. By the time the lake weekend appeared on the calendar, I had stopped thinking like a wife. I was thinking like a prosecutor. Not the theatrical kind, the ones who pound tables and raise their voices, but the disciplined kind, who know that cases are won long before anyone enters a courtroom. Won in preparation, in structure, in the quiet confidence that comes from knowing every question has already been answered. I didn't rush. Rushing is how people make mistakes. It's how emotions leak into places where facts should live. Graham had spent years perfecting the art of appearing reasonable. If I wanted to dismantle that, I couldn't mirror his chaos. I had to outclass it. I treated the truth like evidence. Every night after Graham went to sleep or claimed he was exhausted and retreated to the guest room with his laptop, I opened my encrypted drive and worked. Not angrily, not obsessively, methodically. I built a timeline first. Dates of his Baltimore meetings aligned beside utility usage from the apartment. Credit card swipes plotted against rideshare drop-offs. Travel claims placed next to public records showing when projects had actually ended. One line per fact. No commentary, no adjectives. Truth doesn't need decoration. Next came the money. This was the part that felt almost intimate, the way uncovering fraud always does. Money tells stories people forget to censor. Graham had been careful, very careful, but care is not invisibility. He'd used intermediaries, shell entities, reimbursement codes vague enough to pass casual review. Casual review was not my specialty. I traced patterns instead of transactions, frequency instead of amounts. I followed how often certain vendors appeared, how consistently expenses clustered around the same weeks every month. I documented everything without touching accounts yet, careful not to alert him. Each discovery tightened the case, but it also tightened something inside me. Not rage, resolve. The cold understanding that the man I had trusted wasn't reckless. He was calculated. And calculation, once exposed, rarely survives public light. I consulted Elena Brooks again, this time without hypotheticals. She reviewed my materials silently, her expression unreadable. When she finally looked up, she said only one thing: "This is clean." I exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. "Next steps?" I asked. "We file protective orders quietly," she said. "We prepare to freeze assets the moment you give the word. And we do not, under any circumstances, tip him off." I nodded. I'd already decided that. What surprised me was the grief that followed. Not loud, not theatrical, but sharp and precise. It arrived in the spaces between tasks, when I'd catch myself labeling folders with the same meticulous care I once used to plan vacations or holidays. This wasn't just a case. This was the documentation of a life I had believed in. I paused once, staring at a photograph I hadn't meant to open. Graham and I at a gala 2 years earlier. He had his arm around my waist, smiling toward the camera, his posture perfect. I remembered that night, how he'd whispered that he was proud of me, how I'd believed him. I closed the image and moved on. Emotion could come later. Right now, I was building something that had to hold weight. As the weekend approached, I prepared not just evidence, but contingencies. If Graham denied everything, if he tried to isolate me, if he attempted to spin the moment into confusion or misunderstanding. Each scenario had a response: brief, factual, undeniable. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was preparing a conclusion. 2 days before we were scheduled to leave, Kendra called. "He's suspicious," she said without preamble. Changed passcodes, started deleting messages more frequently. My pulse quickened, but my voice stayed steady. "Is he changing behavior?" "Only slightly. Enough to suggest instinct, not knowledge." Instinct was manageable. "Let me know if that changes," I said. After we hung up, I sat alone in the darkened living room, the city lights flickering through the windows. I thought about Sophia, about the life she believed she was building, about the child she was carrying into a reality she didn't yet understand. I thought about Margaret, who had waited too long to speak. And I thought about Graham, who believed preparation belonged only to him. The case was nearly complete now, the evidence stacked neatly, each piece reinforcing the next. It didn't shout. It didn't threaten. It simply stood. That was the power of it. When the truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't arrive as chaos. It would arrive like a closing argument, calm, precise, and impossible to ignore. There are moments when the truth demands an accomplice, not for revenge, not for validation, but because no lie this elaborate can be dismantled by one voice alone. Graham had divided his life cleanly, deliberately, trusting that the women on either side of it would never meet, never compare notes, never realize they were reading from the same script. Breaking that separation was the most dangerous move I could make. I waited until I was certain, until the evidence no longer felt like a collection of facts, but like a structure strong enough to hold another person's disbelief. Only then did I open a new message window and stare at the blinking cursor, my hands steady, my chest tight. I did not accuse. I did not threaten. I wrote the way I'd learned to write when informing donors that funds had been misused, when telling board members that the organization they loved had been built on fiction. Clear, respectful, precise. My name is Amina Hart. You don't know me, but I believe we are connected through Graham Whitaker. I'm not contacting you in anger. I'm contacting you because I think you deserve the truth, and because I believe you may not have it. I paused there, rereading the words. Tone mattered. One wrong note and the door would close forever. I continued. I am Graham's legal wife. We live together in Washington, D.C. He has not been divorced, separated, or in the process of ending our marriage. I'm attaching documentation that confirms this. If you choose not to respond, I will respect that. But I want you to have information he may not have given you. I attached only what was necessary. Our marriage certificate. A recent photograph of Graham entering our building. Nothing more. Proof without spectacle. Then I sent it. The message disappeared into the void, and with it went the last illusion of control. You can prepare for evidence, you can anticipate denial, but you cannot predict how another woman will receive the knowledge that her life has been built on a lie. 2 hours passed, then 4. By midnight, I was pacing the living room, my phone heavy in my hand, every nerve on alert. I imagined her anger turning outward, her fear turning into loyalty. I imagined her showing Graham the message, giving him time to adjust, to counter, to lie his way out of the trap I was laying. At 1:37 a.m., my screen lit up. I don't understand. He told me you were divorced. He said it was finalized years ago. I sat down hard on the couch, my breath leaving me in a rush. I typed carefully, I'm sorry. I wish that were true. I can answer questions if you want, or we can stop here. The choice is yours. The reply came faster this time. If this is real, then everything I thought I knew is wrong. There it was. The fracture. The moment when disbelief gives way to fear. I told her the truth in measured pieces. That Graham maintained 2 residences. That he traveled between them routinely. That he had been funding his life in Baltimore while presenting himself as married in D.C. I avoided speculation. I avoided emotional language. Facts only. She responded in fragments. He said he didn't talk to you. He said you agreed to keep things quiet. He said you were focused on work and happier without him. Each message tightened something around my heart. I recognized those lines. They were echoes of the narrative he'd been building everywhere, just adjusted for a different audience. I asked her one question. Did he ever tell you why he couldn't introduce you to his family? There was a long pause. He said it would complicate things. Of course he did. The conversation stalled after that, the weight of realization settling in. I didn't push. I knew this moment required space. Shock has its own timeline. 2 days later, she asked if we could meet. We chose a cafe in a neutral part of the city, public, quiet, safe. When she walked in, I recognized her immediately. Sophia was visibly pregnant, her movements careful, her expression guarded but open in a way that hurt to witness. She looked like someone who had trusted the wrong man and was only just realizing the cost. We didn't embrace. We didn't accuse. We sat across from each other like 2 people studying the same wreckage from opposite sides. He said he loved me, she said finally, her voice steady but thin. He said he wanted a family. He said this was real. I believe you, I said, and I meant it. I laid out the evidence then, not as an attack, but as a map. Dates, patterns, receipts, the architecture of the lie. She watched in silence, one hand resting protectively over her stomach, her eyes filling but never breaking. When I finished, she looked up at me with something new in her expression. Not rage, not shame, resolve. I don't want to disappear, she said. I don't want him to decide how this ends. Neither did I. In that moment, something shifted between us. Not friendship, not yet, but alignment. Two women standing in the same truth, refusing to be managed, minimized, or edited. Graham had counted on our isolation. He had never considered what would happen if we compared notes. The cafe was chosen for its neutrality. No shared memories, no familiar corners, no chance encounters that could be traced back to Graham. It sat on a quiet street where people came to be left alone. Students hunched over laptops, early retirees reading newspapers, a barista who didn't look up unless spoken to. Public enough to be safe, anonymous enough to disappear into. I arrived early and chose a table with my back to the wall. Old habit. When Sophia walked in, I recognized her instantly, though we had never met. There was a particular gravity to her presence. Not confidence, not fear, but vigilance. The careful way she moved told me everything I needed to know about the last few days of her life. Her body was 8 months pregnant. Her mind was bracing for impact. She hesitated when she saw me, then crossed the room with measured steps. We didn't hug. That mattered more than it might seem. This was not a moment for performative solidarity or premature intimacy. We were not friends. We were not allies yet. We were two women standing on the same fault line, trying not to fall. "Thank you for coming," I said. She nodded, lowering herself into the chair across from me, one hand instinctively resting on her stomach. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, fear, anger, disbelief, too many emotions fighting for space. "He told me you didn't want to meet me," she said quietly. "That you knew about me and didn't care." I absorbed that without reacting. "He told me you didn't exist," I replied. Her lips pressed together. The smallest, sharpest smile appeared and vanished just as quickly. Not humor, recognition. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of it all pressed down between us, thick and suffocating. Then Sophia inhaled slowly, like someone stepping into cold water. "I need you to tell me the truth," she said. "Not gently, not to spare my feelings, just tell me." So I did. I slid the folder across the table, careful not to dramatize the gesture. Inside were copies, never originals, of what mattered. Marriage certificate, utility timelines, transaction summaries, a calendar that showed, in cold alignment, where Graham said he was and where he actually was. I watched her face as she read. Shock arrived first, then disbelief, then something quieter and more dangerous. Clarity. Her breathing changed, her jaw tightened. At one point, she closed her eyes and rested her forehead against her fingers, as if trying to physically hold her thoughts in place. "He told me he hated DC, she said finally. Said it reminded him of a life he was trying to escape. I nodded. "He told me Baltimore was temporary, just work." A soft, humorless laugh escaped her. "So we were both the lie." "No," I said. "We were both the truth he refused to face." That was the moment something shifted. She looked at me fully then, not as an enemy, not as a complication, but as another human being who had been deliberately deceived. Her eyes filled, but the tears didn't fall. Sophia was holding herself together by will alone. "I didn't know," she said. "I swear to you, I didn't." "I know," I replied. And I did. Everything about her, the questions she asked, the way she handled the information, told me she had believed him. We sat in silence for a few moments, letting the truth settle into its proper shape. Outside, a bus passed. Cups clinked behind the counter. Life continued, indifferent. "I'm scared," she admitted at last. "I'm pregnant. I don't know what this means for my child." Her voice broke on the last word. That was when strategy gave way to something else. Not emotion, not softness, but responsibility. "We will not do anything reckless," I said. "Your health comes first. Your safety comes first. This will be controlled, documented, and supported. You won't be alone in it." She studied me, searching for cracks, for instability, for promises I couldn't keep. She didn't find any. "What are you planning?" she asked. I chose my words carefully. I'm not planning revenge, I said. I'm planning exposure. There's a difference. Her shoulders squared slightly. He's hosting a family weekend, I continued. Donors, relatives, people who matter to him. He believes his worlds will never touch. Sophia's eyes hardened, not with cruelty, but with resolve. I don't want to hide, she said. I don't want to be erased so he can move on clean. I met her gaze and held it. Then we do this together, I said, carefully, on our terms. She nodded once. In that small cafe, something rare took shape. Not friendship, not forgiveness, but alignment. Two women choosing truth over silence, refusing to let a man who needed two audiences decide how either of their stories would end. Graham had built his life on separation. We were about to prove that separation was his weakest point. There is a difference between destruction and detonation. Destruction is reckless. It scatters damage in all directions and leaves no one untouched. Detonation, when done correctly, is precise. It collapses exactly what needs to fall and nothing else. That was the principle guiding everything that followed. Sophia and I did not rush. The cafe meeting had given us alignment, not urgency. Urgency is what men like Graham expect. Tears, demands, emotional ultimatums. He had prepared for that version of us. What he hadn't prepared for was coordination. We met again 2 days later, this time in my office after hours. The building was quiet, the lights dimmed, the city outside reduced to a distant hum. I made tea. She brought a friend, an older woman named Marisol, calm and watchful, who would be with her every step of the way. That mattered. This was not a movie. Sophia was 8 months pregnant. No plan was acceptable unless it protected her first. We laid everything out on the table, literally. The timeline, the evidence, the legal posture, the emotional risks, the reputational consequences. Not just for Graham, but for us, for her child, for the people who would be caught in the blast radius. This can't look like an ambush, I said. It has to look like inevitability. Sophia nodded slowly. I don't want to scream, she said. I don't want to beg. I just want him to have nowhere to stand. That was exactly right. The lake weekend in upstate New York was the ideal stage. Graham's father hosted it every year, a carefully curated mix of family, donors, board members, and old allies. People whose opinions Graham valued. People who believed in his story. Witnesses. But witnesses alone weren't enough. We needed control. We built contingencies like engineers, not avengers. Sophia would not arrive alone. Marisol would drive her and remain nearby at all times. A private room would be secured ahead of time, somewhere she could sit, breathe, and leave if needed. My attorney would be on standby, phone on, documents pre-filed but not yet triggered. And Graham would not be confronted in private. That was the most important rule. Men like Graham excel in private. They explain, they redirect, they rewrite. In public, with timelines and witnesses and two women telling the same truth, their options collapsed. Still, there were risks. 2 nights before we were scheduled to leave, Graham changed the itinerary. We'll arrive a day early, he said casually over dinner. Mom wants more time together. Just us. I kept my expression neutral, my pulse steady. That's fine, I replied. Inside, alarms rang. Isolation was his instinct. If he could keep me separate, keep me close, he could still manage the narrative. I messaged Sophia later that night. He's adjusting plans. Stay flexible. Don't move unless I confirm. Her reply came quickly. Understood. I trust you. Trust is a heavy thing to carry. I felt its weight settle into my shoulders. The following afternoon, Kendra called again. He's watching you, she said. Not overtly, asking staff questions, checking schedules. I exhaled slowly. Is he suspicious of her? No, Kendra replied. He doesn't know she exists as a threat. Yet. Good. That meant the detonation could still be controlled. The final piece was Margaret. I met her the morning before we left, in a small park far from cameras and conversations. She looked older than she had weeks earlier. the cost of silence etched into her face. "I won't stop you," she said before I could speak. "I won't protect him anymore." "I'm not asking you to," I replied. "I'm asking you not to interfere." She nodded. "I'll make sure the right people are present." That was all we needed from her. That night, lying beside Graham in the dark, I listened to him breathe and felt nothing. No tenderness, no grief, just distance. He shifted in his sleep, murmured something unintelligible, and rolled away from me. I thought about Sophia, about the child she would soon bring into the world, about the life Graham believed he was carefully managing, and about the truth, waiting patiently for its moment. A controlled detonation requires discipline. It requires silence when you want to scream, stillness when you want to move, precision when chaos would be easier. By the time morning came, the plan was set. All that remained was timing. And Graham, confident in his control, was walking us straight toward the blast site, completely unaware that the fuse was already lit. The Whitaker Lake House did not announce itself with extravagance. It didn't need to. It sat back from the water on a stretch of manicured land that suggested permanence rather than wealth. Old money confidence, the kind that didn't explain itself. White clapboard, wide windows, a dock that had hosted decades of conversations that shaped careers and quietly ended others. This was where alliances were renewed and reputations were reinforced under the pretense of leisure. This was Graham's natural habitat. The moment we arrived, he slipped seamlessly into the version of himself the world loved. He carried bags, greeted staff by name, laughed easily with relatives he rarely saw. His posture shifted, shoulders back, chin lifted, like an actor stepping onto a familiar stage. No one questioned his belonging. I watched him from a distance, cataloging the performance with clinical calm. The affectionate son, the attentive husband, the principled man who spoke earnestly about growth and community while holding a glass of wine he barely touched. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have believed him again. That frightened me more than anything else. The house filled quickly. Donors arrived in polished SUVs. Board members greeted one another with warmth that masked calculation. Conversations overlapped. Politics, philanthropy, legacy, each one a reminder of how carefully Graham had positioned himself among these people. And me with him. "This place never changes," someone remarked as I passed. "It's comforting," I smiled. Comfort, I'd learned, was often just a refusal to look too closely. The first night passed without incident. Dinner was long, laughter abundant, stories repeated with the indulgence that came from shared history. Graham stayed close to me, his hand resting at my back, his attention performative and precise. He was managing me. I let him. The next morning, he suggested a walk. Just the two of us. The lake was still, mist hovering low over the water, the kind of beauty that invited confession. "Things have been strange between us," he said carefully, eyes fixed ahead. "I feel like you've been distant." There it was, the opening line of his narrative. I didn't rise to it. "I've been busy," I replied evenly. "So have you." He nodded, as if relieved. "Exactly. We've both been stretched thin. Sometimes people mistake that for something else. Something else, like betrayal." He stopped walking and turned to me then, studying my face for a reaction. I gave him none. "I want us to be honest with each other," he said softly. "No surprises." The audacity of it almost made me laugh. Instead, I met his gaze. So do I. For a fraction of a second, something flickered behind his eyes. Suspicion, guilt, fear. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar charm. We returned to the house together, his arm light around my shoulders, his confidence restored. He thought the moment had passed. The rest of the day unfolded with calculated normalcy. Lunch on the deck. Conversations that edged toward future plans, new initiatives, potential campaigns, whispers of influence. Graham absorbed it all, nodding thoughtfully, storing it away. By late afternoon, I noticed the shift. Phones came out. Staff moved with increased urgency. Guests dressed for dinner with more intention. This was the night that mattered. The night when stories would be cemented and loyalties reaffirmed. Graham was glowing. "You okay?" he asked me as we prepared for the evening. "You seem quiet." "I'm fine," I said truthfully. I had never been clearer. As he adjusted his cufflinks, I caught my reflection in the mirror behind him. Composed, steady. Nothing in my expression betrayed the fact that everything was about to change. Outside, the sound of a car engine carried up the drive. Not unusual. Guests were still arriving, but my phone vibrated softly in my hand. "Amina, we're here." 3 words. That was all. I looked at Graham one last time. This man who had built his life on separation, who believed timing belonged to him alone. He smiled at me, confident, unguarded. "Ready?" he asked. I slipped my phone into my pocket and nodded. "Yes," I said. I was more than ready, because somewhere beyond the trees, beyond the carefully controlled perimeter of his world, the final piece had arrived. And Graham Whitaker, surrounded by everyone he needed to believe him, had no idea that his 2 audiences were about to become one. The moment before impact is always quiet. Inside the house, crystal glasses clinked softly. Laughter rose and fell in polished waves. Someone complimented the chef. Someone else admired the view, as if beauty could shield them from anything ugly. The Whitaker's world was humming at full volume, confident in its own permanence. And then there was my phone in my pocket, warm from my hand, heavy with 3 simple words. "We're here." I excused myself with a smile so natural, no one questioned it. "Just stepping out for a moment," I said lightly, as if I needed fresh air or another shawl. Graham barely glanced up. He was talking with a board member near the fireplace, wearing the expression he reserved for powerful men. Open, respectful, eager without appearing hungry. I walked out the front doors into the early evening chill. The sky had begun to deepen into that rich, bruised blue that makes lake country feel cinematic. The driveway curved through trees that had been planted decades earlier, their branches arching like a tunnel. Gravel crunched under my heels with each step, loud in the quiet. Halfway down the drive, my breath caught. Not because I was afraid of what was coming, but because part of me still couldn't believe I was doing it. You can be certain and terrified at the same time. People mistake composure for the absence of fear. Composure is often just fear with excellent posture. At the gate, a dark sedan idled with its lights dimmed. When the back door opened, Sophia stepped out slowly, one hand braced against the car frame, the other resting on her stomach. She looked smaller in person than in my imagination, but the pregnancy made her presence undeniable. No scarf, no coat, no clever angle could hide what she carried. Behind her came Marisol, calm and solid as stone, scanning the property with the instinct of someone who understood that emotional moments sometimes turn dangerous. Sophia's eyes met mine, and for a second she looked like she might bolt. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know," I said, stepping closer but not touching her. "You don't have to prove anything by suffering. If you want to leave, we leave. If you want to sit down, we sit down. You control your body and your pace, always." Her throat moved as she swallowed. The muscles in her jaw tightened as if she were physically holding herself together. "No," she said softly, then stronger. "No, I'm not leaving. I've been living inside his version of reality. I want to stand in the real one." I nodded once. That was all the agreement we needed. We moved carefully, slowly, not dramatic, deliberate. As we walked up the driveway side by side, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not revenge, but a strange, sober grief for how unnecessary this all was. One honest conversation could have saved so much pain. One clean ending. One truth spoken out loud. But Graham hadn't chosen truth. He had chosen management. The closer we got, the more the sound of the party sharpened. The music, the chatter, the soft clinking of glass. Warm lights spilled from the windows, turning the house into a glowing stage. And then, like a ripple traveling through water, the first person noticed. A woman on the porch paused mid-sentence. Her gaze dropped to Sophia's belly. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She turned her head toward the living room as if searching for confirmation that what she was seeing was possible. Another guest looked, then another. Conversations began to thin out, like oxygen leaving a room. The attention moved in slow motion at first, a series of micro-reactions that built into something undeniable. People leaned, whispered, eyes widened, heads turned toward us, then toward Graham, then back again, trying to solve a problem they didn't yet have language for. Inside, a laugh rang out too brightly, then died. We stepped onto the porch. The air shifted, the kind of shift you can feel in your skin. The house, so loud a moment ago, seemed to inhale. Even the music felt quieter, as if it sensed what was about to happen. I saw Graham at the far end of the room, still mid-conversation, still smiling, still secure. He had no idea. Not yet. He turned his head slightly, responding to something someone said, and his gaze traveled across the room toward the doorway. Toward me. Toward her. The transformation on his face was immediate and extraordinary, so fast it was almost beautiful in its honesty. Confusion first, then recognition, then a sudden, sickening calculation. Horror, panic, the collapse of a carefully built world behind his eyes. His hand loosened around the stem of his wineglass. It slipped, the glass hit the hardwood floor and shattered, the sound sharp enough to cut through every remaining conversation. People froze. The room went silent in the way crowds go silent when they realize they are about to witness something they will talk about for years. Graham didn't move. His mouth opened once, as if words might save him. None came. For a brief moment, I saw him stripped of every layer of polish. No charm, no narrative, no ability to manage the room. Just a man caught. Sophia took a slow breath beside me. I could feel her trembling, not weakness, but adrenaline. Her hand tightened over her stomach as if to remind herself why she was here. I stepped forward just enough for my voice to carry. "Graham," I said, calm and clear. His eyes flicked to mine, pleading and furious at the same time, as if my composure was a betrayal in itself. And then I turned slightly, making space beside me, not as an invitation, but as a revelation. "I'd like you to meet Sophia Reyes," I said, "though I believe you already know her." The silence after that line wasn't empty, it was loaded. It was every unwritten sentence, every rehearsed lie, every moment Graham had believed he could keep two worlds apart. And now, with the entire room watching, donors, relatives, allies, witnesses, those worlds stood together in the same light. Unavoidable, irreversible, ready to collapse. Silence is never truly silent. In a room like that, full of power, money, and carefully maintained reputations, silence is a weapon. It is pressure. It forces people to choose sides before anyone speaks. It turns a single moment into a memory that will be repeated, embellished, carried into boardrooms and dinner parties, and whispered into phones on the drive home. Graham stood in the center of it, frozen. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked small. Not physically, but structurally, like something built for display that had just discovered gravity. His father, Thomas Whitaker, moved first. He was a tall man with silver at his temples and the kind of authority that didn't require volume. His gaze flicked from me to Sophia, then landed on Graham with a heaviness that felt ancestral. "What is this?" he asked. No anger yet, just the calm of a man who demanded truth because he was used to receiving it. Graham swallowed. His eyes darted toward me, warning, pleading, rage, all tangled together. "Amina," he started, voice tight. "This is—" "No," I said, softly but firmly. That single word cut cleaner than shouting ever could. It wasn't dramatic. It was decisive. I stepped forward just enough to claim the center without claiming chaos. "I'll explain," I said, my voice steady, clear, built for rooms like this. Because Graham has been practicing his version of the story for months. It's time you heard the real one. A ripple moved through the crowd. Someone's breath caught. A chair shifted. Sophia stood beside me, her chin lifted, one hand over her stomach as if anchoring herself to something real. Graham Whitaker has been living a double life, I continued. For years, he maintains an apartment in Baltimore where he spends 3 to 4 nights a week. Sophia lives there. She is 8 months pregnant with his child. A collective intake of breath swept the room like wind. Graham's mother, Margaret, appeared near the hallway, her face pale, her eyes shining with something that looked like grief and relief at once. She did not speak. She didn't have to. Her presence was confirmation. Thomas Whitaker's expression shifted. The calm hardened. "Is that true?" he asked, voice low. Graham opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I can explain," he said finally. Then, as predictably as a fraudster blaming the accounting system, he went on the offensive. "I was unhappy," he said, voice rising just enough to sound wounded. "Amina and she's never home. She's always working. She stopped seeing me. I was lonely. I made a mistake in it. It got complicated." There it was, the narrative he'd been rehearsing. The emotionally unavailable wife. The tragic misunderstanding. The lonely man who fell into something he didn't choose. He looked around the room as he spoke, searching for sympathy, for softness, for any face that might still be willing to believe him. For a heartbeat, some of them did. Not because he deserved it, but because they were trained to prefer neat explanations over messy truths. Then Sophia spoke. "Don't," she said, her voice quiet but sharp. "Don't you dare do that." Everyone turned to her. The pregnant woman, suddenly center stage, refusing to be minimized. "You told me you were divorced," she said. "You told me it was finalized. You told me you couldn't afford to buy your ex out of the house yet, so you kept separate lives. You looked me in the eye and told me you were free." Graham's face tightened. "Sophia," "No," she cut in the same way I had. "You don't get to soften this. You don't get to make this a misunderstanding. You built a life with me while you still had a wife. You weren't trapped. You were comfortable." Her words landed like stones dropped into a still lake. Heavy, undeniable, impossible to unhear. Graham's younger cousin whispered something under her breath. Someone else stepped back as if distance could protect them from association. Thomas Whitaker's jaw flexed. "And the money?" he asked suddenly, eyes narrowing. "You used our foundation's name for reimbursements. You told me the Baltimore expenses were project-related. Are you telling me," his voice tightened, "that you used my donors to fund this?" The room went colder. Graham's eyes widened, not at the accusation, at the implication. Because this was the crack he hadn't planned for. Personal betrayal could be spun, but money, especially other people's money, was different. "I didn't," he began, then stopped, realizing denial could lead to questions he couldn't answer. "I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I documented everything," I said, lifting my phone just slightly, not as a threat, but as a fact. "Travel patterns, transfers, vendor reimbursements, corporate routing. I have it organized by date and source. Copies are already with my attorney. This will be addressed legally." Graham stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. Not the wife, not the accessory to his image. The professional. The person who knew how to turn evidence into consequence. His mother made a sound, small, broken. Margaret stepped forward, her voice trembling as she finally spoke. "Enough," she said to Graham. "Enough lying." Thomas didn't look at her. His gaze stayed on his son, and when he spoke, it wasn't loud. It was final. "You have brought shame into this house," he said. "Not because you failed, because you chose deception, because you used people, because you thought you could manage everyone like pieces on a board." Graham's face flushed. "Dad, please." But pleading doesn't work in rooms where respect is currency and you've just declared bankruptcy. I turned toward the guests then, not performing humility, not apologizing for the truth. "I'm sorry this happened here," I said calmly. "This weekend was meant to celebrate legacy, but I wasn't going to let Graham control the story while I carried the damage quietly. I won't be edited into a convenient villain. I looked back at Graham, and the composure I'd held for weeks finally let one small crack show. Not tears, but the weight of finality. You wanted to leave, I said. You'll get your divorce, but you will not get to leave clean. Not with lies, not with stolen money, not with two women forced to carry the consequences of your choices. For a second, Graham looked like he might lash out, like he might say something cruel enough to reclaim control. Then he glanced around the room and realized there was no control left to reclaim. The audience he had worked so hard to impress was watching him in full light. And brands cannot survive that kind of exposure. I didn't wait for him to respond. I stepped back, giving Sophia space to breathe, to steady herself. Marisol appeared at her side instantly, ready to move her out if needed. We didn't run. We didn't flee. We walked. Past the stunned faces, past the broken glass, past the life Graham had constructed so carefully and just lost in a single, undeniable moment. Behind us, the room erupted, not into shouting, but into the sound that follows a collapsed illusion. Questions, whispers, disbelief turning into judgment. And Graham Whitaker, the man who had needed 2 audiences to survive, stood in the ruins of his own performance, finally forced to face the truth he thought he could keep separate forever. After the lake house, everything moved faster than I expected, and slower than I wanted. Truth has that effect. Once released, it doesn't explode, it spreads. The divorce filings were submitted within 48 hours. Asset freezes followed. Graham's accounts were locked midweek, the same way I'd once locked fraudulent nonprofit funds. Quietly, surgically, without drama. The legal process wasn't loud, but it was relentless. Evidence doesn't shout, it accumulates. Graham tried to call me once, then twice. Then he sent a message that began with, "I know I don't deserve," and ended unfinished, as if even he couldn't decide what role he wanted to play anymore. I didn't respond. Silence, when chosen, is not weakness. It is closure without permission. Publicly, the fallout was brutal. Donors distanced themselves. Board members issued carefully worded statements about misalignment with values. A planned campaign quietly disappeared from the calendar. The brand he had spent years polishing didn't survive contact with truth. Brands rarely do. Privately, the aftermath was quieter. I returned to a home that felt unfamiliar, not because it was empty, but because it was finally mine. I removed the objects that had once signaled compromise. I rearranged rooms the way you rearrange a life after realizing it was built for someone else's comfort. Sophia gave birth 3 weeks later. A girl, healthy, loud, unapologetically alive. We spoke often, but not constantly. We weren't bonded by romance or revenge, but by something sturdier, mutual recognition. 2 women who refused to be reduced to supporting characters in a man's storyline. She chose her daughter. I chose myself. Therapy helped, not because it erased the past, but because it reframed it. Betrayal loses power when it stops defining you. My therapist said something once that stayed with me. You weren't fooled. You were trusting. Those are not the same thing. Professionally, some doors closed. Others opened wider than I'd imagined. Clients reached out, not for gossip, but for guidance. They said they wanted someone who understood integrity as more than a slogan, someone who knew how to dismantle a lie without becoming one. I started my own consultancy, used my name, my rules. No brand that required silence in exchange for access. One evening, months later, I stood alone on my balcony as the city settled into itself. Lights flickered on, sirens passed. Life continued, indifferent and generous at the same time. I thought about the woman I'd been at the beginning of this story, the wife who believed love required endurance, who mistook composure for safety. And I thought about who I'd become. Not hardened, not bitter, just uneditable. Some stories don't end with forgiveness. They end with clarity. They end with a woman realizing that choosing truth, even when it costs her everything she thought she wanted, gives her something far more durable: dignity, autonomy, and the quiet certainty that she will never disappear herself again to make someone else comfortable. If this story stayed with you, if any part of it felt uncomfortably familiar, let it be a reminder. You are allowed to question the narrative handed to you. You are allowed to gather facts. You are allowed to refuse silence. And if you believe more stories like this deserve to be told, stories about truth, strategy, and women who choose themselves, support it. Like, comment, follow, and share. You never know who's listening at the exact moment they need to hear it. I wasn't edited out of my own life. I rewrote it.